welcome everyone. We're going to talk about the main scandal of Mexico exposing a case of corruption and a great cover-up. Nowadays, everybody always actually says, that there's conspiracy theories everywhere. They talk about, whether we actually made it to the moon or not. Who killed Kennedy? Was it Lee Harvey Oswald? Well, no, in here, let me actually start by actually saying that there will be no question at the end that there was in fact a scandal. The way that history has remembered these events is that there was in fact a case of mismanagement. But they said that at the end they were able to actually say that the coins were good, so there was no scandal. That is not true. And as we actually move along, you're going to see the actual documentation and the discussions that they were having where they acknowledged that in fact there was a problem. King Philip V, by ordinance of January 26, 1718, ordered that the cancellation of the concessions granted to private individuals in the means of Spain. This order was extended on June 9, 1728 to the Indies. Now, as part of this is when they actually decided to make the monedas de cordoncillo, the columnarios. Part of what they actually did was that they lowered the fines from 11 dineros and 4 granos, to 11 dineros. So the coins were going to be produced at a lower fineness, which was from 930 to 916. They also were changing the production from 67 reals per mark to 68 reals per mark. Now, while this was going on, notice on June 19th, 1728, the king sent a decree to the Council of the Indies discussing the very harmful abuses committed to the mints of Spain and the Indies, and he specifically discussed the Mexican coinage. He talked about the fact that on the last fleet that had arrived, they had been a problem with most of the coins that had arrived on that fleet, and in fact that was the reason why he was doing the order of June 9th. So there is no question that part of actually the order of June 9th for the mechanization of the Mexican mint was related to their concerns. And he even actually said that he described this matter as very delicate and of universal importance. Why? Because Mexico had become the world coinage. So realistically, if this was to erupt, it would actually cause a lot of actually concern. Now, from Spain, on June 30th, Jose Patiño, the Secretary of the Treasury, sent a letter to the Viceroy. The letter was basically actually telling him that they had actually been surprised at the omission and malice with which the ordinance had been disregarded, and instructing him to conduct a proceeding to be able to determine, who was to be blamed for this. Now, on that order, on that same actually letter, that's when he also got the order of June 9th for the change of the coinage. Now, why is this important? He received this order on the 30th of December, and as part of this order, they were telling him that he could start producing the macuquinas, the cup coinage, with the lower fineness. Now, notice that the order was received on December 30th, and we'll go in there in a second. By the 1st of January, he was already executing it. Now, the order did not just involve Mexico. Potosi was also found to have problems with the coinage, and Lima, by virtue of Potosi, was also tied up in the entire affair. I'm not going to talk about those other trials that were conducted, but I'm just mentioning it so that you understand that this was a lot bigger. And Spain had a lot of concern. Now, this is important because realistically the wheel had already started going in motion. If the coins were already being produced at a lower fineness, realistically, even if they found that in fact there was no scandal, they had already started actually turning the motion so that if they did find that there was a scandal, then they could hide it. That was the main thing. In Potosi, they found out that the coins were produced somewhat high, somewhat low, so realistically it was not actually as much of a problem. Now that was mismanagement, because you could actually tell that there were no stealing. Lima was only implicated because of the fact that Potosi said that after the orders that had been actually done, where they did have a scandal, they had put a new provision that they needed to send four coins per year to Lima so that they could go ahead and test the coins. And every one of those coins had come out perfectly fine. Well, what little was happening is that the aside from Lima was just put online in the paperwork, and he wasn't testing them. But they didn't know that. So they were actually conducting an investigation in Lima because they wanted to see if there was coordination between Potosí and Lima to try to actually steal money, which was not the case. Now, this is the investigation in Mexico. Now, like I already actually said, notice, on the same date of 30th of December, the Viceroy gave the order to the Mint to lower the fines on the coins. Now, you have to actually agree that the excuse was that they were going to lower the fines and the money that they saved was going to use for the mechanization. But technically, the Viceroy himself was putting the base coins on in the street. Because all the coins had been made at 9:30, but now they were being produced at 9:16. So by doing so, technically the more coins you put on the street that are debased, you're hiding the ones that are already debased, that are in the streets. Now, on January 15th, the Viceroy was able to tell Spain that in fact this order had been executed. He wanted for them to be aware that, like I already actually said, the wheel had already been put in motion. On February 7th, the Viceroy now goes to the Mint, accompanied by the persecutor, Prudencio Antonio Palacios, and the oidor, José Fernández de Beitia Linaje, and his entourage. Now, this right here, I have to actually thank Ricardo de León Talabas. He gave me actually this drawing. I only put it in there for you to actually see what the mint used to look like. This is a hand-hammer mint. Of course, when they actually made the mechanized mint, they built a new facility. But this drawing is from the end of the 1600s. So you have in here the facade of the mint. Now, what you have in here is what they call el arca de las tres llaves, the bolts of the three keys. That's normally where they put the encerramientos. The encerramientos were the coins. Normally, before you put a coin into circulation, you have to bring it over. You have the assayer, you have the treasurer, you have the weightmaster. The coins weight. And once the coins were actually weighed, then they actually grab a coin, they would cut it in half, they would conduct one last test on the coin, the half was included on the caja de encerramiento for this specific purpose. So that when there was a trial, you could go ahead and examine the coins and see if there had been any problem with the coins that had been put into circulation. Now, once at the Mint, the Viceroy ordered Domingo Mendiola. Domingo Mendiola was the assayer of the city, the assayer of the foundry. He also requested for José Eustaquio de León, who was a priest, he was the son of the former assayer, and Manuel de León, his other son, to come over because they had knowledge on this so that they could conduct tests on the coins at the Mint. Interesting enough, the Viceroy ordered for the coins to be melted into bars, which is kind of unusual because normally you would actually test the coins themselves, not actually bars, but he ordered them for better security to be made into bars and to be tested. Well, lo and behold, everything came out fine. So we have no problem, right? The silver coins came out 11.4, the gold coins came out 22 carats. Everything good, but wait just a minute. There was somebody who was not satisfied. And that was the oidor, who was the judge. The oidor said, but how do we know that these coins were selected at random and not planted? So sure enough, with the busy schedule of the Viceroy, the Marquis of Casafuerte decided to delegate the continuation of the trial to the oidor Fernández de Beitia. As part of his proceedings, he also had the matter of when the heck did we start doing 68 reals per mark? Because that was another issue at hand. The coins were supposed to have been produced at 67 reals per mark, not 68. So he went to the scribe's house and he looked at the records, and sure enough, between 1706 to 1709, they showed at 67. 1709 to 1711, the records were missing. Turns out that one of the lieutenant scribes had taken it to his house during a moment of illness, and somebody has stolen them. Then he continued on, and he actually found out the records actually for the following years. He continued on July 1723 to 1728 is when he actually found out that the rate was being recorded at 68 reals per mark. Now, on March 16, 1729, Fernández de Beitia was named first superintendent of the Mint. Now, I already said he was a judge. So what is a judge doing as superintendent of a mint? So that he could conduct the inspection in secrecy. That was the exact purpose while he was being put. And he retained his title of judge. He was superintendent judge. The following day, notice this is March 16. On the following day, they had an issue that they needed, a pressing issue that they needed to handle immediately. The D coins. The D coins did not represent a person, but a monastery. The D was for Desierto, basically for the Santo Desierto, which was a monastery of Carmelites. They owned the office, but initially they had been putting actually the assigner, and they had gotten mad with the previous assigner, who was Jose de Leon, and they tried to remove him. The assigner took them to court, and he actually said, not even if I'm dying can you remove me, because that's not cause enough. So they had to keep him until he died. So what they decided is, okay, well, now we'll put ourselves on the coins, and then we're going to have the assigner be a deputy of us. So he's going to be doing all the assigns, but our mark is going to be on the coins. That way, if we ever have to fire him, we can fire him with these. Now there's a problem though. What does the law say about the assigner mark? Whoever mark is on the coin is responsible for it. So that was a pressing issue. So the first order that was actually given is to remove the D and put the R. You can see the D, it was actually removed, they replaced it for the R. The coins are the same person. Jose de Rivas was the assigner. Same person. Now, once they have done now, you can conduct a trial. And it is interesting because, of course, they were conducting an investigation and a trial simultaneously, because this was a pressing issue. So they didn't have time to actually conduct an investigation, then bring on the charges. So this was actually, call it as they go along. So on April 8th, the investigation was actually started, / actually basically the trial. I want to talk specifically about the assigner and what were the testimonies that were gathered on the assigner. When asked if the assigner was actually minting the silver adequately, several testified that he barely played a role. That's what he actually said. Simón de Carragal, auditor of the books of the Royal Treasury, declared that he had accompanied the treasurers of Luis Sanchez de Tagle. Luis Sanchez de Tagle was the owner of the office of die sinker. He normally had a lieutenant working in there, but Luis Sanchez de Tagle was also a silver merchant. So just for you to actually get an idea. And when he actually went to the mint, he discovered that he had actually officials going over, and they were conducting the assay on the metal without the participation of the assigner or any other mint official. Now, two other witnesses, Juan Antonio Ibanez and Jose de los Reyes, both backed him up and say that they were also had witnessed the same thing. So what did the assigner have to say about this? Well, the assigner said, when questioned, he said that he explained that this was not possible because so many people tested the silver at the mint. Like that was his job. But according to him, many people were testing the silver, so it was not possible for this to happen. And obviously the coins had to be all counterfeit. That's what he said. Now, as for the coins that were counterfeit, the judge decided to go to the Caja de Difuntos. What is the Caja de Difuntos? That's basically the money that actually is left for inheritances. They figured that because inheritance moved very slowly, then there was money in there that could be examined, and it was actually a lot easier. Why was he doing this? Because obviously the encerramientos had already been destroyed. So now they were using the Caja de Difuntos to be able to actually backtrack and be able to test the coins. An interesting fact that was actually presented and it was discussed later is that the personnel at the mint already had a complaint going forward that when Spain said that most of the coins that had come in the fleet were bad, they had not sent an example or had actually given any specifics. For obvious reasons, they didn't want actually this information circulating, but they were saying, how do we even know that those coins are actually coins that we made? Now, on November 15, 1729, Fernandez Abetia expressed that in the testimony and confessions of the summary inquiry, there had been enough evidence to bring charges. Now, regarding the doubt whether proceedings in this matter would cause a scandal, notice this is important because he's already actually basically contending the fact that this could actually cause a scandal. No, in the city, provoked problems in their work at the Mint, Fernandez and Ventia replied that if necessary, the viceroy could appoint interim officials, and in any case, the office of a judge was to impart justice, not mercy. So they were already discussing with him that, hey, look, you're barking up the wrong tree. This can actually cause a scandal. And he was actually saying, well, I'm not stopping. Because realistically, that's not my job. My job is to impart justice. Now, on November 29th, notice, we're talking about 2 weeks later, he placed in the hands of the prosecutor a document in which he formulated actually the charges against the treasurer and the Mint officials. He formalized 9 main charges, although some of the charges actually had subsequent charges. So let's actually basically say that. Now, notice where he actually said, this is what he wrote. The penalty to be imposed would be punitive, pecuniary, or confiscation of assets, and thus avoid the damage to the treasury that would result from their death or concealment. Now, he's already saying, of course, what is the penalty for you playing with the money? The penalty is death. But he's already trying to mitigate by actually saying, well, you know, the penalty that we're going to impose is going to be confiscation of assets. We're not planning on killing anybody. That's actually the main thing that he's already kind of like reassuring that, hey, I'm not going to kill anybody. On December 15, however, the prosecutor ruled that the case was in danger of being nullified if he was required to indict before the confession of the accused, since neither the confiscation nor the complete discharge had been made. Now, on the first week of January, Fernandez and Ventia insisted that they needed to go ahead and arrest the officials and carry out the sentences. But by February, something had changed. One of the biggest issues was that these officials were the ones who had to dispatch the fleet, and the fleet had not been dispatched. And initially, he was actually saying, well, the viceroy could actually put temporary personnel. But how feasible was that? So they were able to bring personnel to the Mint so they could actually supervise them while they were still working their jobs. And he wrote to the viceroy basically asking for the proceedings to be actually delayed while the silver bars were brought over to the Mint so they could actually be processed for the departure of the fleet. Now, on June 2nd, 1730, after the fleet had already departed, and they provided the fares with money, then Fernandez de Ventia, he basically talked to the viceroy, and now notice that he's actually being more forceful about the problems. The first one was a scandal that would result in the most populous city of seeing the treasurer, asar, and officials in the Royal Mint reduced to prison. They're discredited in such a serious matter and such a legality that it is the one that universally measures and justifies the deals and contracts of commerce in which they may perhaps have an excuse for the charges that result from the summary in the low weight of the coins and in the debt that they have produced. Now, Fernandez and Ventia affirmed as dispensable the imprisonment or the seizure of goods and retention of the rights of their offices because the public good and its vindictiveness prevails over the particulars and private. So they were basically actually saying that there was actually definitely a problem. The problem that, of course, they could be discredited if they were put in jail. Now, how are they going to actually mitigate this? On June 16, 1730, the viceroy acknowledges the charges, orders the arrest, and by the way, he's giving them house for prison. House arrest. Part of the house arrest is that you don't want to throw the officials in jail. If you throw the officials in jail, then it's going to actually raise flags that you have a problem. Now, on June 22nd, 1730, the bailiff, Gomez Carpintero, seized the assets of the Mint. The affected parties appealed to the viceroy, but the Marquis de Casaferte determined that there was no reason for appeal. So he was not allowing their appeal. The only appeal that was actually allowed was the Carmelites, which is interesting because, of course, why the Carmelites? Because the Carmelites, since the Azar had actually violated the law, rightfully, they should not have actually continued to be able to appoint officials. But because they were a religious order, then they were actually make an exception, so they continue making those appointments even though, in fact, they were in the wrong. Now, in principles, all the officials should have been actually thrown in the musty, dusty prison, in fact. But they were actually given house arrest. One exception was the Lieutenant Asire. The judge was not happy that he would not confess to his fault. Now, he had confessed. Let me actually say one thing. He had confessed, but he was not as forceful. He was actually saying that the cizalla, which was the extant silver, was bad, but the coins were good, which didn't make sense. If the extant silver was coming out of actually production, then how was the cizalla bad, but the coins were good? Eventually, they tried to actually paint it with a larger brush, trying to actually say that they further actually refined the cizalla. And a prosecutor from Spain, which we will talk about actually later, kind of like actually said, that's nonsense, because you don't have time for that. If you're producing actually coins, you have no time to further refine actually money that in fact is not going to be actually done anything with it except actually go back to the officials. Now, another exception was with the Marquis of Vilar del Águila. He was the Guarda Mayor, one of the main guards, and he was building an aqueduct in Querétaro. And the interesting thing is that he actually said, well, I'm busy, I'm building an aqueduct, I can go to jail. I said, oh, not a problem, we'll just put your lawyer in jail for you. So yeah, so that was kind of convenient.
Good answer.
You know,
Smart.
yeah.
Good answer.
Yeah, I don't know if that's actually still applicable, but now if you want to put you in jail, you can always request, that they put your lawyer in jail for you, as a standby. Yeah. Now, there were two other officials, we're talking about the treasurer Jose Mendez and Jerónimo Hernández de Garcia, who were also found actually guilty. Now, Hernández de Garcia had died, so he basically escaped actually any sentencing because they figured the man is dead. As for the other one, this was actually interesting. They found out, and we're going to actually look at that in a second, they found out that he had gone to the viceroy, and he had told him that there was a problem at the mint. There was no order for the production of the coins at a rate of 68 reals per mark. So obviously the problem was that there's nothing in writing. So they convinced him to actually do an amendment to the mint orders and to put it in writing. But one of the things said, you cannot coerce the viceroy into writing a fallacy, and you can get away with it. You're the one who told the viceroy to put something that is not applicable, so therefore you're guilty, not the viceroy. Now, on February 3, 1731, the viceroy sent to Spain the testimony and developments, because Spain needed to actually basically know what was happening, and there was another interesting thing that was happening in here. Notice, they didn't kill the officials. Well, not killing the official, that gave them the right to appeal. But where the heck would they appeal? The audiencia was not aware of this matter. So therefore, the only avenue for them to appeal was through the audiencia, but the audiencia had no record of the trial. So that brings us back to Spain. When the letter from the viceroy was on its way, the judicial conflicts on this matter continued in Mexico for several months until they were abruptly interrupted. On January 26, 1731, the Royal Board of Commerce and Coinage had been established. Now, that board was specifically put in place to handle this matter. Why? If you had no avenue for appeal in the colonies, what they were actually doing is, well, if anybody wants to appeal, send it back to Madrid. In Madrid, we can keep it contained. That way nobody knows what's happening. But at the same time, there was another problem that arose from that. The remedy was actually basically serious enough, but it also did not allow for lower ranking officials to appeal in Madrid because, you needed to have money. So therefore, the high officials could appeal, but the lower officials couldn't because they didn't have the money to send a representative all the way to Madrid. Now, of course, Spain in August 2, 1731 had ordered that all the proceedings be sent to Madrid, what that actually said. Now, on that same letter from August 2, 1731, Patiño transmitted the royal approval of everything that has been executed in this matter. Now, this is Yeah, it's back on. It's back. Okay, so this is actually interesting because notice that I put it in quotation, and I want to read exactly what was told to the Viceroy. One of the main concerns from Madrid was, okay, this is going to be passed to Madrid, but have you kept your mouth shut? That's what they wanted to make sure, that he had not spilled the beans. So therefore, notice on the letter, everything that has been executed in this matter, as well as the declaration that your excellency has made, that you have sole and exclusive knowledge of these proceedings. They wanted to know that he was the sole person that knew about these proceedings and nobody else. They didn't want to be surprised by transferring this to Madrid and then suddenly now everybody in Mexico is talking about actually the matter. So they wanted this actually transferred actually to Spain, which they did. Fernández de Beitia complained about it. If you know anything about Fernández de Beitia, he was actually a micromanager, and even actually a superintendent of the Mint, he basically micromanaged Peinado later on, and he wanted to keep this in-house because he had been dealing with this matter, and he said, there's plenty of paperwork, I want to continue forward, but they told him, no, you have to send it to Spain. And he basically was actually telling them that there was no way that they could review all that amount of paperwork quickly for them to make a determination. But the reality is that they didn't want to move quickly. Because to them, they had already started actually the cover-up, and they needed to actually be reassured that in fact nothing was going to come forward. Because if something came forward, then you needed to have actually somebody to actually pay the price. So, notice that I had mentioned this. The measure of sending it to Spain basically caused that the lower officials could not actually make an argument. The only ones that could appeal was Medina, who was the treasurer, Elizaga, who was the weightmaster, and Pérez Bello, who was one of the main guards at the Mint. They were all people with money that could go ahead and actually make the arguments. Now, realistically, don't feel bad for the lower officials, because realistically, if Spain was trying to hide this, at the end, if they succeeded on hiding it, they were going to actually basically be able to actually be scotch-free, because obviously they weren't going to go ahead and put the noose on their neck themselves. Without a sense of urgency, the appeal stalled in Spain. It was not until 1735 when it was able to be picked up once again. That's how many years it actually basically took. What you have in here is the order that was actually done for the appeal. You have that it was handled by El Doctor Don Juan Ignacio de la Encina. Who is Juan Ignacio de la Encina? In here you have a small little bio where he actually joined the Treasury Council as a persecutor in December 1733. 4 years later he was appointed persecutor of the Council of Castile, a position that he held since December 12, 1737. He received honors as a counselor of the Royal Council in 1739, becoming a full member of the same on August 28, 1742. You can see in here where it actually says, en la causa que pende en dicha Real Junta contra el tesorero, ensayador y otros oficiales de la Casa de Moneda de México. Now, what I have in here is that the treasurer also submitted a book. I want to be actually just and actually basically mention that of course I was able to see both books. I was able to see the book from De la Encina, but I was also see what were the counter arguments. And the counter arguments are pretty weak. I did not put them on slides, but I am going to discuss them as we actually go through the trial, because De la Encina actually said it. At the same time, I would actually say that probably the treasurer knew that he was in good standing. Because realistically, if they were going to hide the scandal, realistically, there was not many arguments that he needed to make. The document of De la Encina starts from the beginning, and it actually tells us, and this I actually put because we had already talked, that the coins that had come in the fleet were mostly bad. But I want you to see it with your own eyes, where it actually says, cuyo defecto había sido más considerable en la mayor parte de la moneda que había traído la última flota. So we're not talking about actually like 2 or 3 coins that were bad. We're talking about the majority of the coins were all bad. And that was the other thing that was actually presented. That realistically this trial is happening in Mexico. But even De la Encina actually said it. They said, are we actually to believe that the assigners of the kingdom of Spain are bad enough that they cannot actually tell a coin when it's bad? Said, we have already examined these coins. We're continuing in Mexico, but we have already started a determination, and that was part of the reason why they had started the wheel in motion, because they were spooked enough that there was a problem. Now, why is this actually basically important? Because we talk about actually the change of the mechanization. It always actually seems that Mexico was selected because it was the most important mint. It was important, nobody will deny it, but it was also the most problematic. And then you also have to ask yourself a simple question. When Mexico was mechanized in 1732, how come it took for Lima until 1751 and Potosí till 1767? Once again, because realistically, it was not about mechanization. It's about hiding the scandal, and once the scandal was actually hidden, then realistically you could move at your leisure with the other ones, because it was not as problematic. Now, el segundo medio por donde se prueba este cargo resulta de los ensayos hechos de varias monedas que se entresacaron de diversos talegos de la caja de difuntos en que toda la falta de 1, 2, 3, 4 y 6 granos. Now, notice that I had talked about this. I talked about that the coins were being actually pulled out from the caja de difuntos, which was the inheritance money. And they said, not only do we actually have what was done in Spain, but when we actually pull out this money, we actually found out that the coins were bad in 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6 granos. We'll talk about that 6 granos because the 6 granos is really actually basically the top, but that was not actually a coin that was in fact actually from the mint. But we'll talk about that one in a minute. In here, notice that they use the word talegos. Is talegos or talegas? Either way, it's the same thing. It's a bag of coins. You can see that in here they talk about on the 12th of December of the same year, the judge ordered a bag to be actually pulled out from the caja de difuntos, and they pull out actually basically several bags from the years 24, 25, and 26. You can see it actually right there. Now, in there, notice, y habiendo abierto una de pesos dobles, lo reconoció don Manuel de León, contador, y talk about, los mismos acaeció en la segunda de real sencillos y en la tercera, que era de monedas de 2, se encontraron algunos de la D. Interesting enough, notice, después de sacar 3 talegas de los años 24, 25 y 26, habiendo abierto una de pesos dobles, la reconoció don Manuel. No hallaron alguno que tuviera señal de la letra y año en que se labró. None of the coins that they were pulling out of these bags had a year or an assignor mark. We're talking about each of these talega had 1,000 pesos, and I did not say 1,000 coins. Notice that the one that was on 8 reals would have been 1,000 coins. The one that was 1 reals was 8,000 coins. And none of the coins had dates or assignor marks. Now, why do I actually present this? Because we're all numismatists in here. This was not an issue that was actually elaborated further on the trial. But what I want to actually say is that they tried to say as the excuse that because they were producing the coins so quickly, they didn't have time to look at those elements. And the fact is that the planchettes were smaller than the dies, so that happened often. The assignor mark is right next to the shield. I understand if you tell me that you're missing the date, but you're also missing the assignor mark on all the coins. So, like I said, the evidence is right here, and you're seeing it with your own eyes. Now, finally, when they got to the third bag, they still did not find a coin that was dated, but they found a few with these, they said. Well, good for them. Okay. Now, because of this, they went to the cofre, which is the coffer, and they pulled out 2 more talegas. And on those, then eventually you can actually see that, you see where it says M con O arriba, que era la señal de la seca. You know, they were able to find at least some coins that have the D, some coins have the J. So now we're actually basically getting somewhere. For you to actually see, I put this coin because to the person who don't know, will look at this coin and say, what a horrible coin. This is a beautiful coin. Why is it so beautiful about it? Because you have a full date right here, and you have the min mark and the SR mark. That's the best you can have in here. And notice from the documents of the period, finding this was impossible. So therefore, this coin right here, the coiner messed up because he actually put the date and the SR mark. Obviously, he was trying to hide that information. Now, what should this coin look like if this coin was nicer? As a Galano, of course. 1725. So that's normally what a coin that is actually fully struck would look like. Of course, the coins were not that, but I just put it in there since you all like looking at coins, you know, so that you would have actually a reference to see the full design. Now, in here, notice I purposely underlined because they went and they were able to finally actually get. Now we're getting somewhere. They were able to get an 8 real that was actually dated 1728. They also were able to get a 1 real that was dated 1714. Once again, so they could actually basically see these coins. And I was able to get you a 1728 and a 1714. This is most likely what it actually, those coins look like, which are pretty horrible, but at least actually you have actually something. Now, in here, now you actually basically have where they actually look at the coins. And interesting enough, you can see that on the coins that are D, they put le falta 2 granos a la de 2, 3 a tercero, cuarto al número 4, todos de la letra D. All the coins of Azar D were bad. When you go to the bottom, it talks about the coins of Azar J. And they do have actually one that was actually low by 1 gram, by 1 grano. The other one was fuerte, por 2 granos, because they said that it was emplomada. Then they basically had another one was actually bad by 2 granos. So you could tell that the J coins were not actually necessarily better, but they had a disparity where some were high, some were low, you know, it was not as bad. But all the coins of D were bad. And that is important because even if we actually say 1 grano, you could actually say, well, 1 grano might be under the tolerance. But yes, but the tolerance was not a freebie for stealing money. If you basically have coins that are slightly low, you should have a few coins that are slightly high. If everything is low, then the money is walking out. Let's call it what it is. Now, they bring in the die sinker. Why? Because they already knew where this was going. What if the coins are fake? So let's bring in the die sinker and actually basically tell us if the coins are good. You can see in here where it says, habiendo reconocido las 9 monedas de la caja de difuntos, los peritos declararon, el teniente detallador, que según su práctica reconoció que las 4 de la letra D y la de los números 1, 2, 4 y 5 de la referente eran del cuño de aquella casa de moneda y no reconoció por tal la del número 3, falta en 6 granos. So technically he acknowledged, yes, these are done with my dies. All of them except for one. The one that is 6 granos was not made by me, but all the other ones are. And the reason why this is important is because this is going to play later. The fact that the one that was the one that had the most silver missing was not a real coin. It was fake. But in here, you have him actually basically testifying. Of course, part of the, I told you that I was going to tell you about actually the arguments of the treasurer. And his lawyers actually said, how can this guy actually know? Like, the coins are really bad. Like, there's no way that he can tell that he made the dice. So those are the arguments they're actually making. Now, in here you have his name, Hipólito Sarmiento. That was our die sinker. Now, also, they brought in Francisco Monjor. In case that you're actually wondering, Francisco Monjor is also a die sinker. But Francisco Monjor was not there when this actually happened. He was brought in to be the die sinker when they started making the new coinage. But still, because he had knowledge on the dice, he was able to actually come in. And it is actually interesting because to this die sinker, he thought that that particular coin that the other die sinker said that the coin was fake, he also thought that the coin was fake. So at least they were in agreement. The reason why he was on agreement was interesting Because he talked about the number of windows, and he said that the coins had actually, that particular coin had 3 windows, and he had noticed 2 windows. And it didn't quite make sense because the previous coins had 3 windows, but if you look at the cortadas, you will notice that the cortadas that were made by this guy, and they have 2 windows. So obviously he liked 2 windows, so I thought that was interesting. Now, you can also see our new assayer, Francisco de la Peña y Flor. He was also brought in. So now notice that you had actually talked about Mendiola from the foundry. You had actually basically had Jose de Leon, Jose Eustaquio de Leon, you have Manuel de Leon, and you have Francisco de la Peña. So everybody was testing these coins, and everybody was finding that the coins were bad. So there was no question on that. Now, as part of this entire trial, now that you know that the coins are bad, well, now they want to know, well, what the heck is actually basically happening here? Sobre el defecto de la cizalla. We talked about the cizalla, that they were saying that the cizalla was bad. And they brought in the smelter. Now, the assayer was also smelter. So here, he was actually a smelter that was working under the assayer. And they had actually a really scuffle because they talk about the cizalla of Jose Fernandez Pareja. Sorry, who was the smelter. He talked about the cizalla of Don Isidro Rodriguez de la Madrid, who basically actually said that the cizalla was bad. Part of the entire argument that was trying to be made is that the silver bars, when they brought them over, they were bad to begin with. But they didn't buy that, because they actually said, if your job is to take off all the markings on the bar and re-smelt it, then it really don't matter if the bars are bad. Because realistically, there's no excuse. But as part of this is where Jose de Rivas now confesses. He confesses. And you can see right there, además que está salido Ofugio, en todo caso infeliz, se convence por la confección del actual ensayador Jose de Rivas. You're seeing that they're actually saying that he confessed. Because as part of his confession, he went to the treasurer and he told him that I heard that actually the cizalla is bad. And the treasurer supposedly told him, yes, the cizalla is bad, but the coins are good. Which didn't quite make sense. Notice, again, convenciéndose de cierto este cargo por la misma confesión de don José de Rivas Angulo, ensayador, donde hablando de este punto y de la reconvención que le hizo el tesorero de cómo podían estar faltas las cizallas de plata que él había ensayado para moneda. But notice, they're saying that the cizalla is the cizalla from the silver that was to be named in the coins. Now, what did the treasurer have to say about this? I'm not an assayer. Why are you throwing this at me? Why would I even tell him this? I don't know about actually assigning coins. That's the reason why that's his job. The assayer to me seemed to me from the trial that he was very naive. Because he basically threw the treasurer's name almost as if the treasurer would corroborate his statement. Now, we talked about actually some of the documents, and interesting enough, if anybody saw the Marvel movie Black Widow, when she's being questioned, and then suddenly she gets interrupted and she says, why are you interrupting me? These idiots are giving me everything. This reminds me of this trial, and the reason why I say that is because they didn't know that they were missing documents. And everybody kept on giving information outside of the scope of what the persecutor had. And the persecutor said, they keep on giving me everything. They keep on giving me everything. Now, as part of this, a good example that I'm going to actually post just to actually mention is Manuel de Leon, when he was talking about his father, the investigation did not talk about gold, but he decided to volunteer information on gold. He said that 2 of the coins had actually come out bad, and they had actually mixed them with the cizalla, so they could go ahead and actually melt them back down. And when they melted the cizalla, the color was not right. And they were able to determine that when they did the test, somebody had taken out the 2 bad gold coins and replaced them for 2 8 reals. Now, that important information, they said, well, we have no investigation that was ever conducted. If in fact somebody stole 2 gold coins, there should have been actually an investigation on this. They dismissed it out of a technicality. Why? Because even though the person was voluntarily giving this information, they said if your father was able to spot it after the fact because of the color, how does he know that the coins were stolen then? Well, I would say it. He was a good assayer, so probably just the mixture, he was able to determine that somebody had replaced it for 2 8 reals. But still, that was actually a valid point, that he could not have seen somebody steal the 2 gold coins if he noticed it after the fact. So, but like I said, but you can actually see in here that everybody's just providing information, and the persecutor will talk about that later. He will talk about the fact that these people are just giving us all the information, but it's just actually a diatribe on trying to actually basically find information that I don't find applicable. Now, de lo que resulta de esta confesión, que es la más relevante prueba, se halla que decíamos evidenciado el cargo de que la moneda que se labró de los rieles que produjeron las cizallas de Coisidro fue defectuosa en la ley. Notice that in here they're already talking about that we find it, that if you're telling us that this cizalla is bad, so are the coins. Now, they also, like I said, I mean, if you go through the entire trial, they try to actually say, oh, no, because, you know, when we actually made the other cizallas, what we actually do is that we actually mixed it in to try to clean it up. But if the other one was good, not better, if you have 11.4 on one, and you have 11 on the other, if you mix it in, you're going to end up with 11.2 altogether. You're not going to end up with better. So they were just actually basically putting actually the noose on their own neck. Now, we talked about the 68 reals. We just talked about actually the coins, and like I said, there's no question that the coins were bad. And we talked about the confession of the assayer. So now we need to actually basically address another big issue. Why were they producing the coins at a rate of 68 reals per mark? The law was simple, 67. 67 all throughout. Now the treasurer said that he had been there since 1713, and this had been actually done as long as he actually could remember. As part of this, notice that in here you have the ordenanzas that we talked about. The ordenanzas from 1724. And you can actually see in here where it says modificadas. On the side you can actually see where it says 68 reales el marco. That's when they convinced the viceroy to make the changes to the orders, but then they were trying to actually clean themselves up by saying, well, the viceroy did this. But I said, yes, upon your advice. So you cannot actually basically thwart the viceroy in actually doing this and then actually say that this is good. Now, the most interesting thing that was revealed, which is still under investigation, and I don't have an answer yet, is this statement. One of the silver merchants, which was Francisco de Faguaga, he declared that between 1705 and 1708, he had been in charge of the commission of the coinage of silver collected from the royal treasury. So he was in charge of the silver that was actually from the king. Now, he said that the last year, so it would have been in 1708, Jose Durrutia had been in charge of it, and he was the one who had told the Lieutenant Treasurer Manuel de Pereda y Palacio to divide the mark into 68 reals. But only for the king's treasure. Now, why is this of interest? This is of interest because this is the war years. And right now, Spain was actually in trouble that they could not keep the war effort going. There was an archaeologist by the name of John de Brie who found in the French archives that the French were complaining that the coins were not right. And part of the not right could possibly actually basically indicate that the coins did not weigh the proper weight. The Griffon of the 1715 fleet was sent to Mexico to collect payment for the escorts, payment that was due because of the situation on the bad coinage. But even after France told Spain that the coins were bad, they did not order an investigation, which leads me to believe that the king could have been aware of it. Now, why is this important? Because sure enough, it seems that the 68 reals per mark could have actually started basically with the king's treasure, since the king's treasure was going to be used to make payments for the war effort. Who was he paying? His grandfather. So if his grandfather found out that in fact he had actually basically given him actually too little money, which he obviously did, he would complain. Then you could actually say, oh, my bad, I didn't know the coins were bad, don't worry, I'm gonna get you the payment. So you were buying time. But it seems that it is possible at this time, like I said, we need to actually find whether there's corroboration of this statement, especially through the French archives. But if in fact this actually started in this way, it actually would have started with the king, and then it was carried over to the rest of the coinage. So that's why this statement is actually of importance. Now, again, talking about the weight, convenciéndose más y más efugio que se deduce de la citada ley, con la reflexión de que si por ella se hubiera querido alterar el dineral, era indispensable, se hubiera mandado recoger el antiguo. Because they were actually saying that. They were saying, no, but there was an order. We just don't have any records. They said, nonsense. If you order the coins to be made at a different rate, you're going to order the previous coins to be recalled. Which interesting that they would make this statement, considering that they had just ordered the new coins to be made at a different rate, and they did not order the previous coins to be recalled because they wanted to hide a scandal. But that was the argument they were making. Now, the top portion on the fourth charge, no haber deducido feble para su majestad ni tenido arca o caja de él. This is how they got the silver out of the mint. If you steal silver, you still have to find out how the heck do you extract that out of the mint. Part of the cizalla would have been the feble. The feble was supposed to go on this box that was used for public works, and it was part of actually the king's money. But what they did is that they eliminated it. By eliminating it, then any extant silver, which in this case you would have had a larger surplus because you were actually basically making the coins bad, was going back to the merchants. Once the mint went back to the merchants, you could actually go to their house and actually basically divide the profits. So the excess silver was walking out the front door. That's an interesting actually thing. Now, you can see on the fifth charge, you can see where they basically actually, well, they accused the treasurer that he was selling out the lower offices and keeping the money, you know, but the most important part in here, el otro sobre la falta de papeles en el archivo de la casa. Which is what I was telling you, that there were a lot of papers missing on the mint, but these people were just actually basically providing all kinds of information. Now, this was the conclusion of the trial. The conclusion of the trial was, en cuanto a la solemnidad de esta diligencia, así en la saca de la moneda de la caja de difuntos, ensayos de ella, reconocimiento del cuyo estampa, no hay legítima excepción que oponer, como ellas mismas informan, reduciendo las objeciones a voluntarios discursos. So notice they were saying, look, we pulled out the coins, we did a size, we brought in the tie sinker, we were able to determine that the coins were in fact actually stamped with the proper stamp. And all they can provide is voluntarios discursos. So they're saying, all they're saying is actually basically discourses about, well, you know, the coins are fake, the coins are this, the coins are that. And by the way, they got away with it. Let me actually say that. The main argument was that because the coins had been actually pulled out of this, you cannot actually prove that the coins were in fact real. And out of a technicality, they threw the coins out because, well, I mean, that is a valid point. It wasn't valid at all, but it was valid for what they needed. So they basically actually said, well, we cannot actually consider these coins. So, but they did have a confession, correct? So true enough, they had a confession. So they actually said, okay, well, the coins were real, but the cizalla was bad. Because he confessed to it. So we're going to have him pay a fine. Now, the interesting thing is that notice that they were saying that the coins were fake. Well, the persecutor had an argument for that too. He said, tampoco tiene solidez esta objeción mediante que probando legítimamente el cuerpo del delito no es necesaria la continua existencia del objeto físico que lo produce. He even went and he said, this is like a crime where there was a murder. You can actually see it right there. It says, en la causa de homicidio se mantuviese con el proceso el cadáver hasta su resolución. He said, they confess. They said, these people are telling me that the coins are fake. Guess what? I don't care. He said, I don't care because the assayer has confessed. And therefore, with his confession, I no longer need to have the body. And he utilized actually that analogy of a murder trial in which you don't need the body if you have a confession that he actually did it. He even went as far as to actually say that because of these matters being so delicate, he said, corriendo la razón principal que desvanece el repato con mayor vigor en el asunto de que se trata de infidelidad o ilegalidad en la bondad de la moneda, porque este delito como tan grave y ofensivo del Estado admite todo género de probanzas. So they were basically actually saying, hey, look, because of this being such a delicate matter, I can use anything at my disposal to be able to prove it. I said, and I have proved it. Now, concluyendo este artículo con la reflexión de que el juicio que se puede formar por lo discurrido en esto y los demás cargos es haberse tolerado un abuso, inobservancia de las leyes, una negligencia en el exacto cumplimiento de la obligación de los oficiales, cediendo en beneficio de estos y de los mercaderes. So notice, at the end they're actually saying that this is a complete inobservance of the rules. And the officials have benefited themselves and the merchants through this process. 26 June 1738, the board is ready to actually make their verdict. And what is the first actually verdict that they actually made? They acquit everyone on the first charge. Why? Because the information was inadmissible. They couldn't use the coins from the Caja de Difuntos because they could possibly be fake. Of course, the reality is, we're talking 1738. By now they knew that the scandal had been hidden, so there was no reason for them to put the noose on their neck. But I already actually said it. What happens with the confession then? Well, sure enough, you can actually see these are the 9 charges. You can see that the second charge was regarding actually the weight. On the first charge, I want to actually basically go here. This is basically the penalties that were passed along. Among the penalties, you can see that the larger ones are basically, on charge 2 and 3, with charge 2 and 3 being the one on the 68 reals per mark. And the reason why is because the king saw it as what it was. This was to enrich the treasurer, the weight master, and the merchants. So they got hefty fines, every one of them got hefty fines to go ahead and actually be able to actually pay back. On the charge 1, you can actually basically see Jose de Rivas Angulo, charge 1, 2,000 pesos. Jose Fernandez de Pareja, who was the smelter, he got 1,000 pesos. Why? Because they could not erase the fact that they had confessed to a crime. So they said, yes, their confession basically was on the cizalla. So we're going to charge them for that. But the coins were good. The coins were good. Yeah, okay. The coins were good. In here you have actually more. Like I said, I won't bore you with all the sentences, but I put in here actually all the ones. You can see where you have actually the 3 main merchants, the silver merchants, 20,000 pesos, 15,000 pesos, 10,000 pesos. Interesting is Francisco Faguaga, because Francisco Faguaga used to lend money to the king. And when they had the initial trial, he went to the viceroy, disgusted, saying, why am I being interrogated? Well, the viceroy wrote to the king and he said, well, he lends you money and he's very mad. So the viceroy wrote a royal cedula, a decree, thanking him for his services because he didn't want to get him mad. Well, lucky for the king, when these charges came down, he had passed away 2 years prior. So the fine went over to his heirs. So he didn't have to worry about him getting mad again. Although these condemned men appealed the sentence, yes, they weren't happy. Like, they were not satisfied that they had actually basically gotten away with murder. On May 14, 1739, they reaffirmed the sentence. So what happened then? Then the king issued a pardon after they paid their fines. He basically said, these are good servants, minister of mine, and worthy of my royal attention in everything corresponding to the rank and character. And he said, they can go over, collect actually monies that are due. Once they pay their fine, that's it, they're forgiven. So with that, they actually close the file. Now, why do I have in here the Roswell? Because, interesting, part of hiding the scandal also involved how did they actually hit the scandal. Once they started producing the coins at a lower rate, they were broadcasting out, well, the coins that were produced before had a higher content of silver. So then ships like the Roswell, 1739 is when it sank. You won't find actually hardly any SIRD coins. Why? Because even other nations were doing the bidding for Spain. They were destroying the coins because once you destroy them, you turn them into bars and you would think, I'm going to get a large crusade. Wrong. You're not getting a large crusade, but once you destroy the coins, they're done and overweight. So therefore, in this ship, that's why I have a silver bar in there, you do have actually silver bars, and you do have coins from 1721, 30, 31, 32, 33. You find them very commonly, the cup coinage, but not the ones from before. Now, I want to mention these three authors for a reason. These three authors all wrote articles about this. And interesting enough, notice that the first one actually wrote back in 2004, Christopher Rosenmuller. His article is really good. It's in the ANS. And one of the bad things that he actually had is that he stumbled upon Sewell Menzel's book. And I mention actually that basically because his article was going in the right direction and then it goes off the cliff at the end. But it only goes off the cliff because he actually said that he could not mitigate all these asires that he actually threw in there. And he basically actually said that Menzel's book was a new book. He said, well, they have to be right. So he put two different charts to try to mitigate on what could be the case, and that actually basically completely ruined it at the end. But the information on the trial is really good. So he's actually really good. Now, Agustin Pineda Aguilar, he wrote about this actually trial in 1997, and he's on a book called Secas de Fundación Temprana that was published by the Mint of Madrid. And the last one, which is the most recent one from 2017, Felipe Castro Gutierrez. Now, the one thing that I actually want to emphasize on this is that all of them agree on everything in here. The biggest issue that I have is on their conclusions. Because, for example, Felipe Castro Gutierrez, at the end, he actually says exactly what I had said at the beginning, that there was no fraud. What it obviously actually happened was a case of mismanagement. But he actually said that this becomes clear because of the exonerations. But there was no real exoneration. So realistically, and notice, I already actually mentioned it. I said from the eyes of a numismatist, how do you explain that the coins were being produced without dates or asire marks? How do you explain there's a lot more information that we have available today, and in fact, it is completely the opposite. In fact, there was a fraud, but they were able to get away with it. So at the end, once they got away with it, there was no reason to rehash anything. So history is remembering this as mismanagement. Now, in all honesty, if somebody wanted to accept the regular narrative that there was just mismanagement and no fraud, first of all, they can come to me later and explain to me what happened to all the missing silver. But outside of that, that still changes nothing. Why do I say that it changes nothing? Because Spain had been spooked enough that everything they put in motion was to hide a scandal. And if in fact no scandal would have arisen, they still had already started actually basically passing off holes to be able to actually go ahead and actually get away with it in case that it did happen. I already said that Potosí and Lima did not materialize the way that it did in Mexico. But notice what they did. Then they actually said, well, now that we have no scandal, then we have no hurry. They delayed the mechanization of those mints. Mexico, on the other hand, was a pressing issue that needed to be handled immediately, and they did. Anybody has any questions?
Thank you for this excellent presentation. You briefly mentioned kind of like weight tolerances when you said that, you know, if some are a little bit low, there must be some that are a little bit high. Did that come up at all? Because the difference between 67 and 68 is less than 1.5%. So each coin should technically be good, but it's only when you get them in a large group that they become bad.
Correct. No, that's a good question because, well, what they were doing is that they were weighing them by the bag. And one of the things is that the bag should actually have weighed 119 marks, and it was coming down to 117. And they were able to determine that the 117, in fact, was correct for the 68. So they knew that they were maintaining actually that tally. But the biggest actually issue is if you produce 20,000 marks, for example, well, by producing 1 extra real per mark, suddenly you just produce 20,000 reals extra. So therefore, they had a benefit to actually gain on that one. So, oh, by the way, now that you brought that up, I wanted to actually mention another thing because you're right actually about actually what you're actually mentioning there. And that was another one of the arguments. Notice that I had mentioned about the 6 granos, that one was bad. And the persecutor from Spain utilized that in his finding because they were saying these coins are counterfeits. And he said, that's nonsense. He said, I conducted trials for counterfeiting. They provided information from Mexico showing all the trials that they had conducted over the years, which is interesting because Mexico did have a counterfeiting problem. But as part of that, the persecutor said, a counterfeiter tries to steal as much money as quickly as possible. So the 6 granos is basically what I would expect. These 1, 2, 3 granos, I said, no, that's not a counterfeiter. That's the mint. Because nobody's going to wait forever to go ahead and make a quick profit. So he said, that is not, to me, something that is happening with a counterfeiter. So he utilized that, as a matter of fact, as part of the evidence to actually show that those coins, and I already actually said it, this is actually the nonsense. The die sinker said that the coins were made with his dies. And then the argument was he couldn't possibly know this. So, anyone else?
Jorge, thank you so much for your presentation. After the Potosi scandal, the reputation of the silver coins from Spain is damaged, right?
Correct.
Do you think that the way they conducted this was, hey, let's be more careful so that we don't have another global scandal?
Yes, and as a matter of fact, let me actually say it. I believe that Potosi, they wanted to actually basically take it this route. The problem is that Potosi had been going on for years, and it was already entrenched, and it was grievous. Now, I say that because if you think about it, once you look at this entire trial, how it was conducted, the fact that they were actually moving a judge from the audiencia to the mint and everything else, think of the trial in Potosi. They took a judge, a counselor from Valladolid, and they planted it as president of an audiencia. What is the first thing that a president does? He has to conduct actually a visit. So realistically, they probably would have tried to actually make it look as normal as possible in that they were actually basically doing it very quietly. They probably would have tried to actually do something like this where they change finance and everything else to go ahead and actually hide it. But the problem is when Nestares Marin got to Potosi, it was too late. It had already exploded. In here, notice, and that's one of the curious things, that's why I mentioned the dates matter. On the 30th of December, he got the order to lower the finance of the coin. 2 days later, they were already being produced with the lower finance. Correct. So, and if you ask me when did this happen, 1724, and you can say, how can you actually basically name it actually exactly? Because, well, it's the decoinage. And part of it is kind of curious. There were many things that were done. The fact that you actually allow a convent to put a mark on a coin, the fact that you brought actually this person actually in who seems to have been very naive. And Jose de Leon does not actually basically fit the character. And yes, like I said, there were actually problems, but even actually, that was another issue that was brought up. When they were saying all the exams that were done at the mint, they all showed that the silver was 11.4. Again, the persecutor jumped. And he said, that's nonsense. He said, you're telling me that he never had not even a bad day? Said, all the coins are coming out perfect every time. I don't buy it. Said, I don't buy it. So therefore, sure enough, And once again, we go to that thing that we talked about, that some of the things were not exploited further, but we who are numismatists sitting in here and everything, notice Fernandez de Beitia, the judge, actually basically said a simple question. He said, how do you know those coins weren't planted? Well, if all the coins are coming back on the fleet bad, but all the coins at the mint are coming out good, well, you cannot actually then say that it was just mismanagement. Because there were, in Spanish we have a saying that is, cuando el río suena piedras trae, when the river sounds stones it brings. And in here, you basically have where they had already, throughout, being able to actually set up everything so they could get away with it. Now, at the end, there was a bigger problem that we cannot suspect. Some of these silver merchants, they were people who actually lent money to the king. Remember, don't buy the hand that feeds you. So, but at the end of the day, they were able to actually go ahead and actually do this and hit the scandal. The reason why I like putting the Roswick at the end is because it's 1739. We're talking about just 10 years later, the coins could not be found. The coins had already basically been extracted from circulation and are gone. And that to me is actually basically important because it actually shows how successful they were on being able to actually hide it. That just 10 years later, you no longer have actually all these actually problem coins around. And now when you see actually those ugly coins, if they have a date or anything, jump on it. Because yeah, they're really hard to actually come by. But
All right, we want to thank you for your presentation.
you're welcome. My pleasure.